here in Davos. The televised session is co-produced by China Media Group, CCTV Business Channel, and the WEF. It's about China's economic outlook. Given the profile of our audience, the session will be conducted mostly in Mandarin Chinese and sometimes in English. So there are simultaneous translation devices available, and please kindly turn your mobile phones on silent because it's a televised session. And let's get started by a quick introduction to our panel speakers today. So sitting right next to me is Mr. Huang Yiping, a renowned economist, as well as the Deputy Dean of Peking University's National School of Development. Welcome. And sitting to his left is Mr. Pan Gang, Chairman of the Board and President of Inner Mongolia Yili Industrial Group. And finally, to his left is Mr. Benedikt Sobotka, CEO of the Eurasian Resources Group, ERG. Welcome. Okay.
Welcome. Welcome to Davos, the WEF 2020. After the financial crisis in 2008, we are now rebounding, but in an imbalanced manner. And at this time, we also have witnessed the role that China plays in the rebound of the global economy. Now we are at the beginning of a new decade. At the Davos meeting, we are looking at China closer. We know that everyone is looking very closely to China's development and what can China contribute in the next decade. Now let's share with you some figures. GDP of China is the growth is 6.1%, which is first in the world, and per capita GDP has exceeded 1 trillion, and 60% of urbanization rate, and tertiary industries is about 60% of the economic growth. So let us turn to Professor Huang first to talk about the economic growth in China. How would you interpret the figure of 6.1% of economic growth? What areas do you attach importance to? I think if we look at the annual growth rate of 6.1% compared to 2010, the figure is on the decline. However, if we look at future prospects, let's look at the fourth quarter growth rate, which is 6%. A lot of experts and a lot of market observers have actually less optimistic predictions. So this means that China has a stable economic growth, and this is for several reasons. The first reason is that if we look at, there's a détente when it comes to external trade issues, and also the market is supporting the economic growth. Furthermore, in the fourth quarter, our national fiscal policies have also been strengthened. So as a whole, even though the growth rate is on the decline, it is stable. As you mentioned, the adjustments in the national fiscal policy, we know that more than 800 billion renminbi has been released into the market. Now, is it a reaction to the US-China trade tension? I think from a macroeconomic perspective, China's economic growth is still on the stable side. However, of course, we are adjusting our fiscal policy in order to promote economic growth. But of course, if we look at the fiscal policy, it needs to be more aggressive, more proactive. If we compare to 2008 or 2009, when we injected resources into the rail and airline, the air construction, of course, now we need to refocus our energies onto, for example, public security, social security rather. Now, if we look at the market as a whole, the interlinkage is quite strong, and people also are attaching great importance and focusing on the healthy development of the Chinese system. Recently, we have encountered certain issues. For example, a lot of the private enterprises have been facing challenges, in particular in the last year or last two, in terms of financing. They've come across challenges. First of all, if we look at when the economy declines, small businesses tend to be impacted. So this is very clear. Another reason is that in the past, from a macroeconomic perspective, the government has implemented certain policies, for example, deleveraging or protecting the environment, because we're trying to prevent the advent of a financial crisis. These are very good policies that help to promote long-term economic growth. But in the short term, of course, if we look at it objectively, environmental protection regulations, of course, are not necessarily in line with the development of small and medium industries. But as a whole, we have seen that private enterprises have bore the brunt of economic decline. Now, the State Council has implemented many policies that aim to assist the private enterprises to help them grow. As a whole, I believe that in China, the businesses have encountered many challenges. Against the backdrop, as you mentioned, the per capita GDP has exceeded 10,000 US dollars. And before the financial crisis, per capita GDP was 2,000 US dollars. So from 2,000 US dollars to 10,000 US dollars means that costs have, of course, been rising. So China is facing this type of challenge. In the past, we relied on low-cost manufacturing, low wages, but right now China has entered into a new era. And in particular, in the eastern coastal regions of China, we are doing very well. And the government is not intervening in the market. And basically, the upgrading of enterprises is all happening very stably. If we look at the private enterprises, last year, the government has allowed a lot of bot industries, some of the zombie state-owned industries to go bankrupt. Now, what I think is important to point out is that the next step of China's development relies on innovation. Innovation is very much the strength of private enterprises. Now, 70% are private enterprises, 25% are foreign enterprises, and 5% of the companies are state-owned enterprises. So, for example, in terms of infrastructure, this we rely on the state-owned enterprises. However, the private enterprises are the ones who are going to help us move ahead. So we do need to step up our efforts in supporting the private enterprises. Now, the gentleman sitting next to you is a very good representative of the private industry, private enterprise. So, Mr. Pan, can you tell us a little bit about your ideas? Yes, from Professor Huang, we learned that there are a lot of policies implemented by the government to support private enterprise. the Yili Group was a very small business in Inner Mongolia. And as Professor Huang mentioned, the the companies in the southern provinces have always developed ahead of the northern provinces. However, we have enjoyed the fruits of excellent growth. And of course, we produce dairy products. It's a retail product. And we are very optimistic about China's retail market. Now, when we talk about the retail market, Professor Huang said that in 2007, the per capita GDP was $2,000. Now this number has risen to $10,000. If we look at the trend of consumer behavior in China, what are the changes? Of course, now China is implementing the policy of a moderately affluent society, so the retail market will naturally grow. We believe that the biggest beneficiaries of this moderately affluent society, of course, is the private enterprises. Now, our growth rate has been more than 10% successively for the last few years. And as Professor Huang mentioned, the general economic growth, of course, in China is on the decline. But our company experienced 11% growth last year. And in the third quarter of this year, our revenue growth also was above 10%. So I think it's pretty remarkable that we have been able to maintain this level of growth. So we are very optimistic about the consumer market. Now, concretely speaking, if we look at consumption, it represents